はい。Can I start now?
Yes, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Hiro Miyamoto. I'm very happy to be here. So let's get to start. So today, I'm going to talk about the issue of fiscal in Japan. Okay, so first, we can start by considering one simple question. Now you can see number here, 270,000 yen. In Japanese, 27万円ね。270,000 yen. So what is this numbers? Do you have any idea? If you hear 270,000 yen, what do you have in your mind? If you have any idea, please let me know. You don't have any idea? If you want, you can use chat, or if you want, you can turn on the microphone and speak out. Do you have any idea? Oh, it's good. Thank you very much. He or she say that it is average wage of Japanese. It's a very good guess. Do you have any other idea? Somebody said that it is about Japanese average wage. It's a very good guess. Do you have any other idea? No? 270,000 yen. Do you think this is a big number or small number? It depends on you. But okay, let's look at the data a little bit more. So somebody said that this is about Japanese average wages. Unfortunately, it is not. The number is very close, but it is not. So if I ask this question to my students, or I have many opportunity to give some speech in front of or say that is a salary for college graduate. So now, or typical Japanese people's wages. These are the main answer for these questions. Both are wrong, unfortunately. So now let's look at the starting salary for the college graduate. So according to the Ministry of Labor, Health and Labor and Welfare, in Japanese, 厚生労働省ね、average starting salary for college graduate is 220,000 yen, so 22万円 per month. And this contains like taxes, social security payment, employment insurance, so on and so forth. Okay, so but the average wage is 220,000 yen per month. And suppose there is no bonus, okay, then annual salary is 2.64 million yen. So we can simply multiply by 12, we can get 2.64 million yen. In Japanese, 264万円ね. So this is a typical, this is the average salary for a college graduate. Okay. However, as I mentioned, it includes taxes, income tax, residence tax, employment insurance, and so on and so forth. So the actual money you will receive will be much smaller. And the actual salary after tax payment is about 170,000 yen, so 17万円. So if we consider typical college graduate student, starting salary is 220,000 yen. However, after tax payment is 170,000 yen. So these numbers are much smaller than the number in the question, okay? My question is, what is this number, 270,000 yen? So unfortunately, the salary of college graduate student is not correct. On the other hand, if we look at average annual income of a typical household is 5.52 million yen. In Japanese, 552万円ね. So average household, 平均的な家計 receives 5.52 million yen. So it's This includes bonus. So if we exclude the bonus and divide it by 12, typical household receive about 310,000 Japanese yen per month. Okay. So this is a bit higher than the number in the questions. Okay, this is a bit higher than the questions. Then let's look at the data a little bit more. So now we are looking for we are look at the salaries of college graduate and the typical Japanese household. Now let's look at the income, the relationship between income and tax and social securities. Now you can see one tables. In these tables, we have annual income of household. This is the after tax payment. And this is the amount of taxes and the social securities. How can we read these tables? Suppose we have a household whose income is 2 million. That means 200万円, 年収200万円. If the household's annual income is 2 million, this household actually could use about 1.6 million, about 160万円. Why? Because this household needs to pay social security, like a pension, Medicare, and also taxes, income tax, residence tax, and so on. Then the amount of taxes and the social security is 0.42 millions. Okay? Okay? That means this is the amount of taxes. So 0.42 million means 42万円. So now let's consider average household in Japan. As I mentioned, average annual income of a household is 5.52 million. Okay, so this household is between here. Here, this is the household for annual income of 5 million. This is the household of annual income 6 million. So the average Japanese household lies between here. Okay, suppose we have 6 million per year. Then after tax payment is 4.52, 4.51 million. So 451万円. So the amount of taxes and social security is 1.5 million, 150万円. Okay. So a typical Japanese household pays taxes and social security less than 1.5 million. Notice that this 5.42 is the sum of taxes and the social securities. The amount of taxes is much smaller than 5.5 million. This is the key. Okay. Now let's look at a little bit richer family. So if we look at the household with annual salary of 10 million, 1000万円ね、年収1000万円. This household after tax payment is 7.2 million, so 720万円. And taxes and social security is 2.8 million, so about 280万円. So notice that once income level increases, the amount of taxes and social security increase as well. This is because Japanese income system is progressive, especially income taxes. Okay, income tax is progressive. So if you get more money, you have to pay more taxes. And by the way, okay, so this is the basic knowledge. Now let's go back to our original question. 270,000 yen. What is this number? This number is related to Japanese government debt. Okay, in Japanese, 日本の債務ですね、借金. This number is related to Japanese government debt. What is the answer? This is interest payment per second. Okay, this is the amount of interest payment per second. Okay, what do I mean by that? Japanese government borrowed money, huge money. In other words, the Japanese government issued the bond and the government has a huge debt. And since government borrowed the money, so government needs to pay back principal and pay interest. Okay, so if we borrow the money, we always need to pay interest. So that is the same for Japanese government. So the amount of Japanese government interest payment in 2021, last year, was 8.5 trillion yen. So in Japanese, 8.5 兆円。いいですか ?2021 年の日本の、借金の利払いが、8.5 兆円ということですね。Interest payment cost in 2021 were 8.5 trillion yen. Okay, so if we divide this number by 365, let's divide this number by 365. This is the days of a year. We can compute interest payment per day, okay, right? Because total amount of interest payment is 8.5 trillion yen. If we divide this number by 365, we can get interest payment per day. That is 23.3 billion. In Japanese, 23.3 億円ね。So if we divide this number by 24, we can compute the interest payment per hour. That is 1 billion. So 1億円. Similarly, if we divide this number by 60, we can compute interest payment per minute. That is 16 million yen. Okay, 16 million yen. So in Japanese, about 1600万円。1分間につきですよ。Then finally, if we divide this number by 60, we can compute interest payment per second. That is the number in the question. Okay, so what does it mean? So now let me count 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. During this time, Japanese government paid about 108,000 yen for interest payment, right? Because 27 times 4 is 108. So let me use Japanese here. So the unit is mine. So the 1 million Japanese yen. Okay, this is the amount of the payment for interest within 4 seconds. Now let's go back to the previous tables. As I mentioned, typical Japanese household pays taxes and social security 1.5 million. So let's look at here. Okay, so the household with annual income of 6 million pays 1.5 million, 150万円 for social security and taxes. So the amount of tax is much less than 1.5 million. And, within 4 seconds, in the 4 seconds, Japanese government pays interest 1 million yen. That means if you are the average household in Japan and you work very hard and receive the money from your company and you pay the taxes, and this tax just go to the interest payment, and the interest payment does not give anything, right? This money does not spend, this money is not used for like infrastructure investment, education, mutually. No, just pay for nothing, interest payment. Okay, so this is the situation of these countries. This is the situation of these countries. Okay, so Japanese fiscal situation is very, very severe. Okay, every 1 second, this country pays interest payment to 270,000 yen. Okay, so now let's look at that a little bit more. So why the Japanese, the fiscal situation is so bad? Okay, now let's consider the situation of a household. So let me pick up some specific household. Okay, suppose this household has annual income 6.3 million yen. in Japanese 630万円ね。年収が630万円の家計を考えましょう。Let's consider the household with annual income of 6.3 million yen. Okay, and this household spends 10.7 million yen. So in Japanese, 1070万円。Okay, so annual income is 6.3 million yen, and this household spends more than that 10.7 million yen. So difference between them is a deficit. So the deficit is 4.4 million yen. Okay. Perhaps it would be okay if this happens only 1 year. Sometimes we need sometimes we need some money. For example, if you have kids and kids get married, then you have to pay a lot of money for the celebration, for example. Then we need temporary money. Okay, if that is the case, it is fine. But it is almost impossible to continue such a spending plan, right? If every year the household receive the income 6.3 million, and if every year this household spend 10.7 million, then eventually this household will run the bankruptcy, right? And unfortunately, this household has a loan. Let's imagine this household has house. The amount of loan is 9.99 million yen in Japanese, 9,900万円ね。99 million yen. So please imagine that the household, this household has a house loan, okay, home loan or car loan. The amount is 99 million yen, and the annual salary is 6.3 million yen, and the total spending 10.7 million yen. Do you think this household is sustainable or not? My answer is it is not sustainable. Okay, it is not sustainable. And this is the situation of Japan. Okay, this is the situation of Japan. Why? Let's look at the government budget in 2021. I'm sorry, the inside of this chart is Japanese. Okay, but let's look at the left chart. Right chart. This is the revenue. This is the government revenue. Please look at this amount here. Total revenue of Japanese government in 2021 was 106.6 trillion yen. Okay. Now let's decompose this. Then you notice that here, this part is debt. Okay. So the amount of debt, amount of bond. Okay, amount of bond is 43.6 trillion yen. So if we subtract this number from total revenue, what we can get is tax revenue is equal to 63 trillion yen. Okay, so imagine that 63 trillion yen. So that is similar to these numbers. Okay. On the other hand, the government spent 107 trillion yen. This is total spending. And every year, this household borrow the money. Okay. This is the 40% about total revenue. Now let's look at the expenditure. Okay. The expenditure is 107 trillion yen. And the amount of payment for debt interest and the principal in Japanese, kosai, this part is 24 trillion yen. This is 1/5, about 1/5 or 1/5 to 1/4 of total revenues. Okay, 24 trillion yen. And also the largest proportion is Social Security, the pension, Medicare, health insurance. Okay, this is 35.6 trillion yen. Now let's look at the defense spending here. This is defense. Defense is 5.3 trillion yen. Now let's add all of them. Okay, first we need a defense. No matter what, we need defense. Okay, so defense is necessary. So 5.3 trillion yen. And we have to pay interest and the principal. Okay, that is necessary money, 24 trillion yen. And if we keep social security system, we need 36 trillion yen. So in total, we have 65 trillion yen for these three components: social securities, okay, interest payment and the principal for the Japanese debt, and defense spending. Now let's look at the tax revenue. Tax revenue is only 66 trillion yen. So suppose government could not borrow the money. In other words, if government cannot issue new Japanese government bond, Japan needs to live within the tax revenue, right? If we cannot borrow the money, we have to live in our income. What is government income? That is tax income, okay? Tax revenue. That is 63 trillion yen, 63 兆円. On the other hand, if we look at the expenditure, only three components: the defense, the payment for a bond, and social security is 65. So that is more than tax revenues. So we cannot pay for example, infrastructure, education, and the remittance to the local government. So that is the situation of these countries. Okay, this is the situation of these countries. Okay, then the question is, why has the Japanese government debt increased so far? Okay, so please look at this chart again. I'm sorry, this is written in Japanese. You can see gray line and the black solid line here. This is the gray line. Okay, and here we can find this black solid line. They are government revenues and the government expenditures. Okay, the gray line is government expenditure. On the other hand, this black solid line is government revenue. Revenue means tax revenue. And notice that up to early 1990s, okay, both expenditure and the revenue increased. And although the expenditure always exceeds tax revenue, okay, here, this period, but the difference was not that big. Okay, difference was not that big. By the way, this difference is deficit. Deficit. In Japanese, 赤字ね、政府赤字。As long as the expenditure exceeds the revenue, we have deficit. But the deficit was not that big until early 1990s. However, after 1990s, while expenditure continue to increase, on the other hand, tax revenue declined almost for 20 years. Okay, up to 2011 or not 2011, 2014 or 2013, up to 2013 or 2014, tax revenue declined. So since the expenditure increases and the tax revenue declines, so there are a huge gap between them. And so government runs deficit every year. Okay, this area is deficit. Okay, you can see deficit increased. Okay, and after 2014 or 2013, tax revenue start to increase. This is due to Abenomics. Okay, Abenomics. However, still, you can see huge gap between expenditure and the revenue. Okay, so the point is, since early 1990s, Japan's economy stagnated. This is called lost decades or lost 20 years. Okay, since Japanese economy has stagnated almost for 20 years, during that time, tax revenue declines. On the other hand, because of the aging, the social security costs increase. That's why expenditure increase. And we can see the large gap between the revenue and the expenditure. And moreover, in 2020, we have a COVID-19 crisis, and the government spent a lot of money. For example, government pays one time $1,000 cash payment, 10万円の現金給付ね, for example. And also government provides some subsidy for the enterprises. Because of that, the government expenditure increased very sharply here. Okay. On the other hand, tax revenue decline. That's why the government debt increases sharply in the last few years. Okay. This is the situation of the Japan. Now let's compare the fiscal situation of Japan with other countries. This chart shows debt to GDP ratio. Okay, debt to GDP ratio. What is debt? Debt is accumulated fiscal deficit. In Japanese, 累積債務. And now I divide the amount of this accumulated fiscal deficit by GDP. Okay. Then let's look at this number. Japan is this blue line. Okay. This is Japan. This is our country, Japan. In 2020, Japan's debt to GDP ratio was 257%. This is the highest in the world. This is the highest in the world. If we look at the G7 countries, the Italy's performance was also not that good. However, Italy's debt to GDP ratio is less than 50%. Okay, 150%. So Japan's government debt is much debt to GDP ratio is much higher than other G7 countries, and this is the highest in the world. Okay. Okay. This is the situation in these countries. Okay. And unfortunately, further increase in the spending is now expected. Okay. Expected. Why? Because we expect accelerating aging. Okay. Remember, the main reason why government expenditure increase was aging. Due to the aging, we need more payment for social securities, pensions, and healthcare, Medicare. And if there is more elderly peoples, it is more likely the government need to spend the money for social securities. Okay. And have you ever heard 2025 problem in Japanese? 2025年問題ね. Have you ever heard 2025 problems? What is 2025? This is a year baby boomers become 75 years old or older. Okay. This is 2025. So baby boomer is the people who was born between 1947 to 1949. Now they are old peoples and they become more than 75 years. That is 2025. Okay. And according to United Nations, the definition of old people or elderly people is a people whose age is more than 65 years old. Okay. So elderly people or old people. Old means 65 and older. Okay. However, this old people, there are a lot of the old people, and within the old people, we have relatively young old people. For example, just 65, or some people is 75, some people is over 90, 100, blah, blah, blah. So we have the many types of older people, and they are different. They are different. And especially the difference between 65 to 74 and the 75 plus, there is a huge difference between these two types of the elderly peoples. For example, from later half of 70s, okay, medical expenses will increase dramatically. So if we compare the elderly people whose age is more than 75 and the elderly people whose age is between 65 and 74, people age 75 and more spend about 4 times more on medical expenses, 9 times more on the long-term care. Long-term care means 介護ね, yeah? Compared to those age 65 to 74. So in 2025, baby boomer, the chunk of elderly people becomes more than 75. So we could easily expect medical expenses and long-term care increases dramatically. So we expect that the social security costs continue to increase, okay? So on the other hand, the tax revenue, if tax revenue will not increase, Japan will run the deficit every year. Then as a result, debt will accumulate more, okay? So this is the situation of this country, okay? This is the situation of this country. Then what's gonna happen? Can we continue this? Perhaps the answer is no. Why? Eventually, Japan will face fiscal crisis, okay? Fiscal crisis. Some people say that Japan will not face fiscal crisis, okay? But for example, the IMF, many scholars in the world think Japan will face fiscal crisis, okay? So now let me talk about this, okay? First, what is a fiscal crisis? Fiscal crisis is a situation, okay, of national bankruptcy. That means government cannot pay back its debt. This is the situation of fiscal crisis. In Japanese, 財政危機ですね。Fiscal crisis is 財政危機。財政危機っていうのは、国が借金を返せなくなる状況のことを言います。Okay, and you may think Japan will not face fiscal crisis. Perhaps the answer is no. And if we look at the world, fiscal crisis occurs every 10 years or several years. Okay. Of course, the country is a bit different from Japan, but for example, Greece faced a fiscal crisis 10 years ago, 2010, and Argentina, there is fiscal crisis 2001 and the last 12 years ago, 2020, and even last year faced the fiscal crisis 20 years ago. So this is just example. Indeed, if you look at the data, the many countries face the fiscal crisis. And most of you may not know, but Japan also almost faced the fiscal crisis in 1945. Okay. So this is history. This country almost faced fiscal crisis. That times, Ministry of Finance, okay, increases tax rates dramatically and avoid fiscal crisis. Okay, so it is possible fiscal crisis take place in these countries. Okay, then. As I mentioned, the fiscal crisis is a situation country cannot pay back its debt. That means government cannot issue the new bond. Okay, as long as government issue the new bond, government can pay back its debt, right? I'm sorry. What's happened? I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. So as long as government can issue the new government bond, okay, we can pay it, government can pay back its debt, okay? However, if government cannot issue a new bonds, okay, then we have to live within the range of tax limit. So as I mentioned before, for example, last year, 2021, tax revenues was about 63 trillion yen. And if we have to live within this tax revenue, if we pay mutually, payment for interest and the principal of the government debt, social security, that's end. We cannot pay for education. We cannot pay for infrastructures, okay? That means some, like, for example, if your family work in some national government agency, definitely government will not pay the salaries, okay, wages, impossible, okay? So that's gonna happen. Then it affects our life dramatically, okay? Major change in our national life. This is the fiscal crisis, and the fiscal crisis is approaching to Japan, okay? By the way, it is important to note that it is not always bad for the country to borrow the money, okay? Sometimes borrowing money is a good strategy. For example, if we want to do infrastructure investment or education investment, these two investments lead to the national development. So in order to get the money for infrastructure investment or education investment, the borrowing money is not that bad things. That is a wise spending, okay? And also, during the recessions, sometimes government needs to conduct fiscal stimulus. Fiscal stimulus is 財政出動ね。景気が悪い時に財政刺激するということです。This is the basis of the fiscal policy, or this is the basic of macroeconomics. So it is also fine. In order to conduct the fiscal stimulus, to borrow the money was not that bad idea. However, the issue is if the amount of debt become too large, market participants will question the sustainability of the debt, okay? Once market participant questions the sustainability of debt, they will not buy the bond issued by government. Then government cannot borrow the money. Then fiscal crisis will take place. Okay? And then question is, the question is, the fiscal crisis will actually occur or happen in these countries? Recently, some people who believe modern monetary theory, MMT, this is the modern monetary theory. Recently, some politicians promote this theory, and some scholars also believe this theory, MMT, modern monetary theory. According to modern monetary theory, as long as a country has their own money, in the case of Japan, Japan has our own money, yen, okay? As long as the central bank could issue or print own money, we don't need to worry about fiscal debt, because if government or central bank print the money, we can use that money to pay back the debt. This is the principle of the modern monetary theory. So according to them, well, we don't need to worry about government debt. We should spend more to boost the economy. This is their argument. And they always say that, well, let's look at the homepage of the Ministry of Finance of Japan. Okay, I took this photo from Ministry of Finance website, and it said that, okay, here, Japan and the US, these two countries had own currency. As long as a country has own currencies, the country will not face the default, the fiscal crisis. So Ministry of Finance said that. So the people who support MMT always pick up this photo and say that, okay, even Ministry of Finance said that Japan will not face fiscal crisis. Why we worry about fiscal crisis? People say that. Well, if we just look at this homepage, only one page is, yeah, this is true. But actually, if we go to the Ministry of Finance website, and if we look at the long document, there's a lot of assumption. For example, as long as the debt level is like below some threshold or not huge, then that default will not take place. This is what the Ministry of Finance said, okay? And indeed, if I discuss with government officials, especially the Ministry of Finance people, they really worry about the fiscal crisis. And recently, the top of Ministry of Finance published one report, okay? And he worried about the fiscal crisis. So indeed, Ministry of Finance worry about fiscal crisis. This is not only for the Ministry of Finance. I'm sorry. For example, the IMF also concerned about debt sustainability, okay, especially due to the declining birth rate and aging populations. And 2 years ago, the IMF published a report for Japan. The name is 2019 Article 4 Staff Report. This is a report for Japan. And it said that clearly IMF mentioned that the government debt is more likely to become unstable, okay? And in order to avoid fiscal crisis, what Japanese government should do is to raise consumption tax to 15% by 2030, 20% by 2050. This is a proposal by the IMF. Not only the IMF, other scholars, very well-known economists also proposed to raise consumption tax. And I agree with that. I support the argument. I also worry about fiscal crisis in Japan. Okay, well, so let's go back to the MMT's argument. Okay, yeah, theoretically, as the MMT said that if Bank of Japan, since Bank of Japan can issue the Japanese yen, BOJ could support buying the government debt. It's possible. They're simply printing money. But then what's going to happen? If the amount of money, okay, if the amount of money supplied to the market increases, there is risk of rising inflation. Once inflation increases, interest rate also increases, okay, right? Because once we face the inflation like current US economy or European economy, the central bank should change the monetary policies. So you know the news. In the US, now the US economy faces a huge inflation. In order to reduce the inflation, now the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve Bank, plan to raise the interest rate. And once the interest rate increases, what's going to happen? We have a huge debt, and the interest payment also increases, okay? That means payment for interest increase dramatically. So everything become opposite way. And it is very hard to pay back its debt for Japanese government. Okay, so this is the situation. So what we have to do is let me see. Okay, where I am now. Okay, so what is the key issues? Okay, so to avoid fiscal crisis, we have to reduce the debt. Okay, how can we reduce the debt? It's a simple but difficult. There is no silver bullet, and we have to cut spending or increase revenue. This is the only way to reduce the huge debt. Okay. So as I mentioned, there is no silver bullet. We have to increase tax revenues, reduce spending, or both. And some people say that we have to focus on increasing the revenue. Okay, how can we increase revenue? There are two ways. First one is economic growth. If economy grows, as a result, if economy grows, company earns more money. and people also get more money. As a result, tax revenue increases. This is one way to increase tax revenue. The other way is we have to increase tax rate. Okay, there are two ways to increase revenues. One is growth. The other one is change tax system. And my personal opinion is it is a bit dangerous to rely on economic growth. Okay, Japanese economy stagnated the last 30 years, so it is hard for us to expect rapid economic growth from now on. Moreover, as we discussed last time, in Japan, the population decline and aging. So due to the population aging and declining the population, potential economic growth of Japan decline. So it is not so easy to expect a high economic growth or sustainable economic growth for Japan at this moment. So therefore, it is a bit dangerous to rely on the growth. So unfortunately, the only way to increase revenue is we have to increase taxes. Okay. So the question is, if we want to increase taxes, which tax we have to increase? So there are three types of taxes. One is the income tax, corporate tax, and the consumption tax. My personal opinion is consumption tax should be increased. Why? Because this tax is most fair for all the generations, okay? Especially for you, for younger generation, to raise consumption tax is the most fair. And so perhaps as IMF proposed, we need to increase consumption tax after COVID-19 period. Okay. And in the meantime, it is also important to cut spending. Okay. Spending cut is important. Especially, we have to change social security system. The current social security system is not sustainable. Okay. So what we can do is, for example, we have to raise age at which pension payment begins. Okay, currently people can receive the pension at the age 65, but compared to the life expectancy, average life expectancy, the age of starting a pension is a bit low. So we have to increase that, and also. We have to mitigate, I'm sorry, this is long, since the medical insurance burden, I'm sorry, and also currently the elderly people pays only a part of the medical insurance. So it is important to increase their burden, okay? So then we can reduce spending, okay? This is what we needed. And one more thing I want to talk about the effectiveness of fiscal policies. Okay, so far we look at how we reduce the Japanese governmental debt. Okay, but now we are in the pandemic period. We are in the COVID-19 crisis. So our economy is stagnated. Okay, then during that time, we may need the fiscal stimulus. Okay, as I mentioned, during the recession, to conduct a fiscal policy, to conduct a fiscal stimulus is a basic of fiscal policy or basics of macroeconomics. Okay, so let's consider the effectiveness of fiscal policies. Actually, in last 20 years, 30 years, during the last decade, Japanese government has implemented a lot of fiscal measures, one after another. For example, in 1990s, 130 trillion yen was invested. So 130 兆円 in Japanese. And about 200 trillion yen was invested in 2000. So in 1990s, 2000, a total about 330 trillion yen was invested. Okay, this is the government spending. Moreover, as we know that during the Abenomics period, government spent a lot of money. So indeed, Japanese government spent a lot of money last 30 years. However, unfortunately, economy did not recover. Okay, Then why? The question is why? There is some possibility the output effect of fiscal policy may have been weakened. Okay. Since the government a lot of money, however, the economy did not recover. Why? There is one possibility. The effectiveness of fiscal stimulus becomes weak. Okay. So how can we confirm that? How can we check this? Then we have to compute so-called fiscal multipliers. Fiscal multiplier captures the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus. Okay. And now let me introduce one of the research I conducted in the IMF. So if you're interested in, please look at the IMF offshore blogs. And what I found was in the aging economy, the effectiveness of fiscal stimulus becomes weak. So I proved this both theoretically and empirically. So if you're interested in the detail, please go to the IMF website. The point is, once country become aged, the effectiveness of fiscal policy become weak. This is just, by the way, this is not only for the fiscal policy, monetary policy too. Okay? In the aged economy, the effectiveness of fiscal policy and the monetary policy becomes weak. And this is a very, how to say, yeah, this is a very strong messages, and it has a huge policy implication because of that. So 3 years ago, in 2019, there was G20 summit in Osaka. That was the first G20 summit held in Japan, and Japan was host countries. That time, this research result was presented in front of the ministers of finance and the ministers of labors, and G20 has a report, and this result was in the report. And now the World Economic Forum, this is the famous for Davos meeting, also pick up this. And recently people are thinking about the effectiveness of fiscal policy and monetary policy in the aging economy. Okay, all right. Okay, okay. So that's it. So today I talk about fiscal. So let me summarize. So let me summarize in Japanese, just in case. So 今日は財政の話をしました。で、日本の財政がどういう状況なのかってところから話をしましたね。で、いろいろと皆さん聞かれると思います。ニュースを見たり、いろんな意見があります。財政に関しては、ある人、僕みたいに財政が危ないって言ってる人もいれば、財政大丈夫だって言ってる人もいるので、どっちが正しいかっていうのは皆さんのご判断にお任せしますが、これ非常に重要なイシューです。もし財政って破綻すると、もう国のことなんてね、で、しかも単位が何兆円って聞いてると、なんか普段想像つかないんですけど、財政が万が一にもこれ破綻すると、国民生活ぐちゃぐちゃになります。さっきも言いましたように、税収の範囲でしか生活ができなくなるんですね。借金できませんから。で、税収の範囲だけで生活しろって言った場合、日本の場合は国防費払って、借金への返済をして、それから年金とか医療とかね、必要なものを払ったらもうお金全部なくなっちゃうんですね。だから教育もできない、投資もできないっていう状況になる。で、教育とか投資ってこれ未来に関するものですからね、そこにお金が回らないっていうのは国の経済はこれ発展しなくなります。それから国家公務員の人は当然これお給料支払わなくなります。インフラにお金が回らなかったら電気、ガス、水道全部大変なことになります。そういうことが起こるかもしれないよってことなんですね。だからもっと真剣にこれ考えなくちゃいけない。で、起こったらこれ国民全員の問題になります。で、日本では最近 MMT とか言ってる人がいますけども、で、一時 MMT っていうのは海外でもね、ちょっと考える価値があるんじゃないかって言われて、私もかなり勉強しましたけど、どうもちょっと怪しい部分があるなっていうのは未だに思ってます。で、ここに来て世界の経済の動きがだいぶ変わりましたから、本当にあれですね、ちょっと一時前まではコロナだから、財政をもっと付加して、多少借金してでも国の経済を復活させましょうっていう潮流が本当この2年間ぐらいありましたけど、だんだんワクチン接種も進んできて、足元でオミクロン広がってますけど、少しコロナの状態化っていうものがね、 見え始めたので、世界の機関はこのデッドをどうやって減らすのかっていう方に完全にシフトをしています。日本ぐらいです。財政極めて危険です。海外のメディア、それから国際機関、日本の経済状況をすごくこれシビアに見てます。だからここはぜひ皆さん、各自考えていただいたらよろしいかなと思います。で、特に若い方、皆さんのような大学生の方に考えていただくのが重要なんですね。なんでかっていうとね、究極財政危機が起こりましたとなっても、おじさんおばあさんそこまで害受けないんですね。害受けるのは若い方です。皆さんまあ人生残り70年、80年ありますからね。人生100年時代なんで。で、今財政危機なんか起こされるともう経済ぐちゃぐちゃになりますから。絶対起こしちゃいけない。で、そのためにどうすればいいのかってことは、これ、国民一人一人が真剣に考える課題なんですね。っていうことで、まあ今日は財政の話をちょっと取り上げてみました。僕の意見が全てではないので、本当に、まあ興味がある方は、ぜひいろいろと文献等を読んでですね、また小谷先生っていう非常に優秀な先生いらっしゃいますから、いろいろと先生に相談しながら、聞かれてみてもいいんじゃないかなと思います。で、最後1個だけ宣伝をさせてください。実は、今月半ばですかね、1月の14日にですね、PHP 研究所、PHP ってところから新書、一般向けの新書を出しました。101のデータでいう日本の未来っていうのが、出まして、今一応こう Amazon でベストセラーになってます。で、ありがたいことに。で、これはまあ、今日話した財政もそうですし、日本の成長である、医療である、教育である、気候変動問題である、労働であるということを、一般向けに書いてます。で、全部データをつけて、かつ、アカデミックリサーチですね。ちゃんと学会で、まあ、これ、まあ、正しいよというふうに、プロが認めている論文の結果を全部、中学生、高校生でも分かるような言葉でまとめて、日本の今の現状、それから今後どうなるかっていうものを、私なりに書かせていただいた本です。もし興味ある方がいましたら、Amazon 等でですね、購入をしていただけますと、よろしいかなと、嬉しいかなと思います。まあ、2回にわたって、お話しさせていただきまして、誠にありがとうございました。じゃあ、フロアこれ、小谷先生にお返しします。
はい、宮本先生、どうもありがとうございました。せっかくの機会なんで、If you have any question, just ask Professor Miyamoto. For instance, like some of you may be interested in working in an international organization. 例えば国連とか、まあ、インターナショナルオーガニゼーションというのは国連、まあ、IMF、インターナショナルマネタリーファンド、and United Nations とかね。で、まあ、宮本先生は、東京大学で教鞭を取っていたこともあるんですが、その後にIMF、インターナショナルマネタリーファンドっていうね、国際機関で働いた経験を持ってます。宮本さん、What do you think about possibility of working in an international organization? At least, as far as we discuss each other, I mean, the salary was quite good. That's what we have discussed, no?
Yes.
例えば国連とかその国際機関で働くと、あれだよね、税金払わなくていいんだよね。
そうですね。
手取りがいくらだったかとかね、すごい言ってもこれ問題ないよね。
問題ないです。まあ、一応参考までに言うと、IMF も国連も世界銀行もサラリーいくらもらってるかっていう、これホームページに出てますから、別に僕がいくらもらってるかっていうのは僕がどこのポジションにいたかっていうのは知らない限りは分からないんですけど、例えば IMF だとまあ、国際通貨基金っていう、まあ、経済、これ国連の団体なんですね。国連の専門機関で経済を専門にやってるのが IMF と世界銀行と2つありますけど、ほぼほぼサラリーは同じで、ちょっと IMF が高いんですけど、例えばそうですね、新卒のスターティングサラリーは多分手取りで1000万ぐらいですね。手取りで1000万ぐらいで、そのエコノミストでもある程度ランキングが上がると年収は多分3000万は超えます、軽く。
で、まあそういったように、私がちょっと僕も宮本さんからこの話聞いて、ね、宮本さんちょっと小谷さんも応募したらどうですかみたいな話してくれたけど、
はい。
まあ 皆さん、グローバルコンピテンシー、この授業を通してですね、いろいろ可能性を自分なりに見つけていただいて、で、宮本さんから宮本さんと話して、衝撃受けたのは、国連で働いて、ポジションいいとこ行けると、そんくらいサラリーで、しかも税金払わないのかみたいなことで、ちょっと欲望がかき立てられたことは覚えている。で、だからなんだって。
でも、あとはですね、あとは国際機関で働くことのメリットは、お金がいいっていうのもあるのかもしれませんけど、それ以上に、集まってる人たちはすごい人が集まってるんですよ。で、例えば僕が一番最初に所属したグループがありましてね、僕ある国の担当してたんですけど、ヨーロッパの国なんですけど、その国の担当する人って5人ぐらいのチームなんですよ、わずか5人である国の経済を1年間徹底的に見て分析してポリシーアドバイスを考えるんですね。でそれもちろん IMF 内部で承認を受けなくちゃいけないんですけど、実際実動部隊って5人ぐらいなんです。でその5人で現地に行って現地の大統領とか中央銀行総裁とか財務大臣とかとワントゥーワンとか1対向こう10人こっち5人とかで議論をして経済アドバイスをするってことをやるんですけど、例えば僕が一番最初に配属になったチームの同僚は今パキスタンの中銀総裁やってます。例えばね、それとかつまり IMF に残ってても出世する人もいるし、辞めちゃって自分の国に帰って中央銀行総裁になるって人もいますし、そういう人たちがたくさん働いてます。で、もちろんみんな異なる文化、異なる言語ね、いろんな違った宗教の人たちがいるので、非常にその多様性の中で生活ができるので、視野はものすごく広がると思いますね。で、やっぱり国際的な視点から自分の日本という国も見られますし、で、特に日本人のスタッフは国際機関で少ないんですよ。今出てる本にも実は書いてますけど、興味あったら読んでください。国際機関で日本人ってもっといなくちゃいけないんですね。っていうのは日本の政府って多額のお金をですね、国際機関に拠出してるんですね。で、これ日本人の感覚から言うと違うかもしれませんけど、海外っていうのは金出したら口出していいんですよ。逆に金出してるのに口出さないってもったいないことで、日本は、IMF でいうとアメリカに次いでも出資してる国なんです。ところがじゃあスタッフがアメリカ人に次いで2番目にいるかって言ったら全然いない。で、全然いないってどういうことかっていうと、日本の意見が全然反映されないってことです。よく巷でなんか間違った本が、それこそ財政の話なんかするときに、日本の財務省は消費税とか税金上げたいって言ってますよね。だから IMF に頼んで言わせてんじゃないかと言いますけど、全然そんなことありません。そんな力はありません、日本政府。そのぐらい国際機関ってフェアなところなんですよ。で、そこで日本人スタッフがいないってことは、日本の国際的なプレゼンスがこれ下がっちゃうんですよね。だからそういった意味でも国際機関みたいなところのグローバルなフィールドで活躍する日本人がもっと増えたらいいなとは思います。
はい、ありがとうございます。皆さん、私が言いたいことはですね、まだ皆さん大学2年生ですね。で、自分がどういう職業について、どこら辺でどのくらいの年収欲しいのかっていうところで、そういうことをちゃんと思い描いて、そこに努力できる人間がそこに到達できる可能性があると思っていて、で、グローバルコンピテンシーの中で、いろいろ英語で紹介してきたこれまでで、今日は宮本さんですけれども、皆さん、実際に私も宮本さんも あなた方の年齢ぐらいの時には、あなた方と何も変わらない、英語も下手くそでしたよね。今も下手くそだけど。
そうですよ。
で、普通に日本の大学出て、そこから多分宮本さんも僕も一緒だったのは、なんとなく夢は描いてたことはあったと。だから宮本さんも私もアメリカの大学に行ったわけで、で、皆さんがどういう夢を描くかわからないですけども、その夢次第では非常に人生充実させられる可能性があると思っていて、友人の一人として私は宮本さんのことを若い頃から見てきましたが、非常に充実した、自分のキャリアパスを充実させている人だと思います。やっぱりそこにはビジョンとか自分の将来に対する あれがあって、宮本先生が将来、日本銀行の総裁になることを期待して、ぜひ日本をより良い方向に導いてください。で、皆さんも、ぜひ宮本さんの言われたことをちょっと頭の片隅に置いてですね、ああ、そっかと、そういう国連とかで働くと給料あるんだ、いいんだみたいなことはちょっとまず一つはあることと、まあ今日なんか日本の置かれてる立場みたいなことをなんとなく理解できればと思います。Question.
Yes, Sensei.
You are specialized in Japanese economy. Do you have any comment or question to Professor Miyamoto? Or audience, if you have any question, please ask Professor Miyamoto. This is a quite unique opportunity for you to directly talk with somebody who works in an international organization and specializes in macroeconomics as a specialist, expert in the field. Kosha, first, do you have any question or comment?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Excellent. Miyamoto Sensei, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I truly enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
I have several questions, but probably I will just concentrate on two that occupying me most. First, you said that to tackle the fiscal imbalance, the debt of the Japanese government, the best way is to gradually increase the consumption tax, which has in fact been done for quite a while. In this sense, I have a concern because one of the big worries in the current Japanese economic situation is that the demand is quite low, internal demand. And the fear is that the increase in the consumption tax will further depress the demand. So my naive and simple question is, why facing the situation when the big Japanese companies, they've accumulated huge funds, they are quite rich, why not to tax the companies and instead of taxing the common people? Why do you think that the consumption tax increase is the most justified and fair way to handle the current situation?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That is a very, very good question. Good question is very hard to answer. And it's a very crucial. My answer is the following. The first, among the taxes, consumption taxes are most fair for all the people because as long as we consume something, we have to pay. So that means not only working age people, but also elderly people. Everybody needs to pay consumption tax. This is a fair tax. Okay, this is a fair tax. On the other hand, as you mentioned, this is true that the Japanese company has a lot of money inside, and they didn't spend it. So there is some possibility we could increase corporate tax. Yeah, sure. But the issue is if we increase corporate tax, it will affect wages because if government need to pay high taxes, then in order to keep the profit levels, one way to do so for firm is to reduce wages. So it affects the income level of the consumers or employees. So that's why in order to, and moreover, this corporate tax is highly fluctuating, volatile over the business cycle. Compared to income tax and the corporate tax, the consumption tax is stable. It doesn't depend on the business cycle so much. So that's why in order to get the sustainable tax revenue, the best way is consumption tax. This is the most natural neutral tax. That's why I recommend to increase consumption tax. But as you mentioned that currently, the Japanese situation, Japanese demand is a bit low due to the COVID-19 crisis. So I do agree that at this moment, we don't need to increase consumption tax. But my proposal is after COVID-19 crisis, we have to start rising consumption tax. And moreover, what important thing is that although we are now in the COVID-19 crisis, government needs to discuss the way to increase consumption tax or a way to finance or way to raise the revenue. This is what we need at this moment. We don't need to actually raise consumption tax or any other tax at this moment. Okay, I do agree that. However, we have to discuss how to rebuild the fiscal situation. This is important. Do I answer your questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Sensei. If I'm allowed, if we have time, a quick follow-up question, if it's fine.
Sure, fine for me.
Fine,
Yeah.
fine. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So you said that we, in the situation of Japan's longevity, it would be logical to raise the retirement age. And against this background, so most of the elderly people who are now working in Japanese companies, they are employed under the so-called Nenko Joretsu, lifetime employment system. So it's quite costly, and plus it's also, I wanted to say seniority-based system. So the older they are, the higher salary they receive. So if we raise the retirement age, that means that these elderly workers will be receiving even more, and it will put more strain. And recently, what the Japanese employers have been doing, they've been practicing early retirement and transferring the elderly workers to some part-time jobs. And I feel it's very unjust towards the elderly workers who devoted all their lives to companies to end up in such a relatively miserable situation. So how do you think, what would be the ideal way to transform the salary system at the Japanese companies?
No, I do agree with what you mentioned, and that is also my concern. And my proposal is, as you mentioned, that why it is hard for the company to hire the elderly people is most of Japanese companies keep or maintain Japanese employment practice, especially seniority wage system. As long as we keep this wage system, the productivity of a worker is not equivalent to their wages. Okay, especially for elderly peoples, the wage is higher than the employees' productivity under the seniority wage system. So I think it is very important to change the wage system. Or moreover, I always propose that it is important to make Japanese labor market liquid or flexible. Japanese labor market is very rigid. We have to change this system. Otherwise, as you mentioned, it is hard to keep the elderly people. And even we want to continue to, if the company want to maintain or keep the elderly people, their employment situation will be miserable because they have to work as a non-regular worker, not regular workers. So the point is, it is important to conduct the labor market reform, and especially we have to change seniority wage system. And the wage should be wage should reflect productivity. Okay, this is my proposals.
Thank you very much.
All right, Kostya, thank you. まあ、ちょっとランダムに指しますね。
日本語でもいいですよ、日本人の方は。
じゃあ、ランダムに指します。ゆうた今井さん。何でもいいんで、質問1個。It's okay to use English or Japanese. Which language you like? Just use and then ask the questions.
はい。聞こえます。
何でもいいですよ。何でもいい。興味のあること。
はい。
できれば宮本さんにしか答えられないことがいいかな。
はい。聞こえますか？
聞こえます。
聞こえます。
日本が財政危機に、直面するかもしれないという話を聞いて、自分的には、外国とかに興味があるので、そちらに飛んで回避するっていう方法はあるのでしょうか？そちらの方が良いのかという質問です。
面白い質問ですよね。それは人それぞれだと思うんですよ。で、まず最初に、前回も話しましたけど、今世界っていうのはもうグローバル化が進んでますよね。だからそのマーケットっていうのは別に日本人だから日本が自分のフィールド、日本がマーケットって思ってる考えはそもそもちょっとこう、なんていうのかな、 視野が狭いような気がするんですよね、僕はね。その日本の企業で働くにしてもいいんですよ、日本はいい企業がたくさんあるしね。どこで働くにしても、どこで生きるにしても、日本でずっと暮らしていくっていうのも素晴らしい選択なんだけど、やっぱりとはいえ、世界に目を向けておくってすごい重要で、そういう視点から言うと、日本の状況がやばいんだったら、と感じるんだったらね、海外に行きましょうって、実際そういう人たくさんいますからね。で、私の友人なんかでも、例えば日本のそういう財政危機とか、日本の状況が日本がいつクラッシュするかわからない。だから、お給料は全部ドル建てでもらってるって人もいますしね。だから人それぞれだと思います。で、ただし、悲観すべきことはたくさんあるんだけど、いい面も山のようにやっぱ日本ってあるわけです。すごい些細な話になりますけど、トイレの水が飲める国なんて世界で日本ぐらいしかありませんからね。で、ヨーロッパなんか行くと、いいレストラン行ってもお水って全部、お金取りますよね。つまり、お水みたいな天然資源っていうものが、日本って実はすごい恵まれてて、それこそ、ビル・ゲイツとかね、世界の富裕層が今、日本の軽井沢とかの土地をすごい買いまくってます。なぜかっていうと、水なんですよ。これから地球温暖化が進んでって、多分水資源っていうものがすごい重要視されていると。だから、その辺にもう目をつけている人は、日本っていう国の水資源はすごいっていうんでやってるわけね。でこれ例えば一つの例ですけども、それから、いまだにメイドインジャパン、メイドバイジャパンの商品っていうのは、特に東南アジア、中東なんかでは、そのクオリティが非常に高いっていうふうに認識をされています。だから、そういったものがね、その国内市場だけじゃなくて海外に出ていくと、実は日本の商品とかってものすごく価値があるんですよね。だから日本には日本のすごい良さがたくさんあります。で、当然経済も再生するチャンスもあるし、日本の国民のそのアベレージの学歴レベルってもう世界で飛び抜けて高いですからね。もちろんいろんな課題はありますよ。課題はありますけども、相対的に見て、前回も話しましたけど、パスポートが世界中で通用する国なんてないわけで、日本ぐらいしか。いい面たくさんあるわけです。だから、なんでしょうね、そこはだからどうするかは個人の選択なんじゃないですか。海外に行って海外で暮らすっていうのもいいと思うし、日本っていうのはすごくいい資源がある。で、これをキープしたいと思うのか、もう潰しちゃっていいと思うのかじゃないですか。だから、もし日本ででもやっていくんであれば、そういう、海外は海外でいいと思いますけどね、海外は海外で辛さもあると思うんで、で日本は日本でそのいい面と悪い面があって、じゃあ悪い面をほっといていいのかっていうとそうではないでしょうと。悪い面があるんだったら、それなんとか自分で変えてやろうっていうふうに思わないと、特に若い人が思わないと、それはなかなか世の中良くなっていかないと思いますね。だから、どちらでもいいと思いますね。答えになってるのかな。はい。
ありがとうございます。
はい、どうも質問ありがとうございます。今井さんね、多分私からも今宮本さんのことを受けて、本当に海外行ってみて、日本人として何人として海外に行くか分かんないですけど、要は海外に住めば自分が何者かってことは避けられないクエスチョンなんだよね、自分にとって。なんで僕はこの世の中に生まれてきて、何のためにっていうようなことを海外に長く住めば住むほど質問する。で、研究者の中でも非常に優れた人、海外で活躍した日本人でたくさんいるけれども、やっぱり一定量以上の割合で多くの人が海外でどれだけ活躍しても日本に帰ってくるような場合が多いと思うんだよね。で、そういう人たちっていうのは、やっぱり海外に長いこと住むことによって、結局日本の良さに気づいて、やっぱり帰ろうって思う人もたくさんいるっていうことは、多分一つあるんだよね。だからそこら辺のところをなんとなく自分で考えながら、ちょっとこれから将来いろいろ決めてみるといいと思います。じゃあ、あと一人ぐらいランダムに誘そうかな。alright. 江本さん。If you have any question, just ask anything. In Japanese, in English, it is fine. 江本さん、よろしいですか？聞こえますか？江本さん。
はい。
はい。何でもいいので質問。コメントでもいいですよ。
えー
まあ、特になければいいんじゃないですか。
はい。
じゃあ特にないです。ごめんなさい。
はい。こういう機会もあると思うんで、次なんかこう質問されたときは、パッとなんか言えればいいですね。はい。じゃあ分かりました。宮本さん。じゃあ今回はそろそろ時間になりましたので、これで、今回の授業を終わりにしたいと思います。で、次の授業はですね、またオンラインで多分やることになると思います。今のオミクロンの感染状況を見ると。で、皆さん、今回を機に宮本さんのことを、知ったと思いますので、これから活躍に注目してみてください。で、皆さんも宮本さんの言われたことを念頭に、日本ってこんな国なんだなと、こういういろいろ思いながら、皆さん、これから将来の計画、さらに立てて、大学生活充実させてください。じゃあ、宮本先生、今日はどうもありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。また、はい。ありがとうございます。
はい。じゃあ、これで今日のグローバルの授業を終わりにします。
はい、失礼します。
はい、ありがとうございました。